To do the trimming of our thumb partial, the first things that I've got are safety glasses and face mask. I'm going to put those on. Then I've got a selection of burrs here, and I have my bench lathe over here. I'm going to start the trimming with the bench lathe using the large fast cut stone and the large and small egg burrs for the bench lathe. And then these are the burrs that I'm most likely to use here in my hand piece. A simple large taper burr for the hand piece is the most useful and most likely thing that you're going to use. This is just one of my favorite burrs. This is a small taper burr for the hand piece, and I use this a lot. If there's for some reason you have a lot of material that you need to take away with your handpiece, this is a coarse burr, which is for acrylic or plaster, and it lets you take the acrylic or the plaster away faster without the plaster gumming it up as quickly. I don't tend to use this in the lab very much, but when I'm working in the clinic, and all I've got in the handpiece, then I use this burr. And there's a couple of other burrs here that I'll go over as we get to them. So let's start our trimming. So the first thing that I suggest you do is get yourself a pencil and think about where you want to trim your denture to. Now, I'm not sure if you can see, but there's the scribe line that I did in the palette for our posterior border. All you have to do is find your scribe line, and that's going to tell you where your posterior border is, so where you're going to trim this to. Now, you should use a pencil to mark this. If I use a pencil, you won't be able to see what I'm marking, so I'm going to use a Sharpie. Do not use a Sharpie, use a pencil. I'm only using this so that you can see what I'm drawing. So this is my scribe line, and that's going to be my posterior border. With our orthodontics, what we did was we trimmed the acrylic to about half the height of the posteriors, and across the anteriors we trimmed it flat. With a partial, it's going to be different. We're going to trim the acrylic just above the gingival margin. We only want a couple of millimeters of acrylic down here at the gingival margin. So our acrylic is going to have this very curved shape around the teeth, and that's called scalloping. And we're going to do that in the anterior also. What's the difference between this and ortho? In ortho, what we're trying to do is control the teeth. We want to hold the teeth in place to where they've been corrected, or we want to move the teeth and be able to effectively put a force on the teeth. So we have the acrylic, about half the height of the lingual of the tooth, and in the anterior we want to control the anterior teeth so they can't rotate, so we have the acrylic flat and going across a fairly wide area of the tooth above the cingulum. Partial dentures, the patient is wearing this all the time. The patient is trying to speak with this clearly and easily. So we don't want to have acrylic on the linguals of these teeth, which is going to interfere with the patient being able to speak. And we're going to scallop all of this acrylic down and have usually just a millimeter or two of acrylic around the gingival margin. Now, I didn't take out, there's a little bit of wax right here. This is the wax that I used for blocking out. If there's a lot of wax, you can boil it out. In most cases, you're going to have to boil it out. In this case, I can just pick off that little bit of wax there. Okay, so I'm going to start with my large stone here, and I'm going to use the large stone to shape the partial. I'm going to take away the bulk of the acrylic and I'm going to give it its shape. I'm going to start by trimming into the midline. And shaping my posterior border to that scribe line that we put. Now, even though I shaped the acrylic as I was adding the acrylic to this, you can see that there's still a fair thickness of acrylic there. So I'm going to have to reduce that. I'm going to come into the posterior teeth. I'm going to use the corner of the stone here, and I'm just going to cut down in this curve. I'm going to come down in the center of each tooth and then up at the interproximal, and I'm going to create that scalloped shape. And I'm going to do that for all of the teeth, the anterior teeth also. I'm going to end this scallop about, at this point, a couple of millimeters, 2-3 millimeters above the gingival margin. I can adjust it later. I will use my handpiece for the fine tuning. So I've now got the basic shape of the partial. I'm going to start removing some of the bulk of the acrylic. I can just use the side of my big stone here. And I'm going to trim this posterior border down to about 3 millimeters. Do not trim away your score line. Get close to your score line, but don't trim it away. And while you're trimming this, one thing to be really careful of, I'm kind of doing it automatically. Think about where your tooth is here, because it's really easy to shift this a little bit and trim away your tooth with the other side of the wheel there. So be really aware that you're not doing this and just completely trimming off that tooth. I'm going to thin it here along the linguals, again to about 3 millimeters. Come to the lingual of the denture tooth there just a touch. So what I'm doing with this large stone is just the shaping and the thinning. I'm doing the large reduction and giving it the shape that we're going to want it to have. And this lets you do it quickly and easily because you can directly see the area that you're trimming here on your stone. So there's my basic shape. Honestly, normally I would have taken away these little bits of acrylic also with this big stone, but you probably don't want to try that, so I'm not going to show you. I'm going to go to my large egg burr. The large egg burr is going to smooth together the shapes that I made with the stone. The stone tends to make flat surfaces. It produces facets or facets in the acrylic, flat planes, and I want to blend those together and smooth things out and round things. I can do a little bit of thinning. I'd like to end up with this acrylic about 3 millimeters thick. I can come to the lingual of our tooth here a little bit and smooth that. And now I can just go into each of the scallops here and just round the scallops a little. Be careful not to hit the tooth when you're doing something like that. This is a little bit thick in this area, so I'm just going to take a little bit out there. Okay. So that's most of the trimming and shaping of our partial done there. Now this is still a very rough surface, but if I was in a hurry, I could go and polish this now. I'm going to have to clean up around the tooth. You can clean up around the tooth using a burr in your handpiece. So I can take a burr in the handpiece and I can gently take that acrylic away. My favorite way to do that adjustment around the teeth is to use these sandpaper discs. I think we have these in the dispensary. Sandpaper discs are wonderful, especially for partial dentures, because they flex a little bit and they allow you to create curves easily. So if you're using a sandpaper disc in the handpiece, you place the sandpaper so it's facing the mandrel. It's on a screw head mandrel. You place the sandpaper so it's facing the mandrel, and then you can trim like this very gently and shape it. If you're going to use a sandpaper disc in the bench lathe, then you have the sandpaper facing out from the mandrel. You'll notice these ones that I have a square hole in them, and you can get this cool little mandrel that goes with them, and they just snap onto the mandrel. So really easy to change them. And if you're using a sandpaper disc, you're going to change them a lot. So if I'm going to use this in the bench lathe, I'm going to have the sandpaper facing out like this. I like to do it in the bench lathe because I've got lots of control with 2 hands on the denture and my sandpaper steady in the bench lathe. Very easy to control what you're trimming. Handpieces are wonderful. A lot of people love them. A lot of labs, all they have is the handpiece. But there's a lot of things that the bench lathe just does better. And so using the bench lathe, this is basically now ready to polish. I'm going to use the handpiece to make it a little better. I'm going to use my coarse burr here because I don't want this to take too long and put you all to sleep. So I'm going to fine tune to my line for the posterior border there. So I'm going to come perpendicular to the occlusal plane, and I'm going to trim up to that posterior border. And I want this to be almost square. Don't trim this so that it comes to a really sharp edge, or when you go to polish it, you're going to end up with a very sharp edge there. Now that I've got that nicely to my posterior border, it's going to blend together the curves in the acrylic a little bit. Now I'll switch to a finer burr. This one's got a little bit of muck wax or light cure or something there. So before I use it, I'm going to use a stainless steel brush, or you can get brass wire brushes. And I'm just going to clean the burr. In general, I'll use the brass brush, because as you do this, you get a little bit of the steel into there. If this is stainless steel, that's fine. If it's they're usually stainless steel, but whatever brush you use is going to contaminate your burr a little bit. And if it's a fairly cheap steel brush, it can actually start to rust. So I'm going to now use my handpiece on very low speed. So I'm only going about 2,000 or 3,000 RPM. I'm not pushing on the burr. I'm just running the burr back and forth across the acrylic. And this is just going to smooth out any ridges or valleys from trimming with my bigger burrs. It's going to make this all smoother. And again, I'll come in around each of the scallops. Take a little bit of acrylic off the lingual of the tooth here. This is why you don't want to use a Sharpie, because it's going to be hard to get rid of it. So again, I could go and polish this now, but and in a simple case like this, I might. I usually trim as well as I can. I smooth as well as I can before I go to do my polishing, because it's much easier to make things smooth and get the shapes you want when you're trimming than when you're polishing. Polishing just tends to flatten things and you can lose shapes that you want. I'm going to just touch up my tooth here. There's little bits of acrylic on the tooth. If you remember when I did the demo, I tried to demo snapping off the matrix, and the tooth moved, so I got a little bit of acrylic on the tooth there. So I'm just making sure that this is all clean. So other things that I can do to smooth this before I polish, to make polishing easier. This is called a split mandrel. It's just a mandrel with a split up the center, and you put in a little piece of emery cloth like that. I like to use this. These are things that you would use more so on a full denture. But again, using slow speed, and this basically sands my denture. Don't go really fast, but it lets me smooth all of this without really changing the shape. So I've already created my shape during the trimming, and this is just smoothing it all to make it easier for me to do the polishing. All the rough areas that you can get out are going to make it easier for you to polish. Another thing that you can use, there are these silicone rubber points for acrylic. These are the large points, and this is a fairly coarse one, this is a more medium one, this is a fine one which will act as, you can actually use that as a high shine or a precursor to high shine. Again, I like to use these on very slow speed. I know some people will use these on high speed. I find if you use it on high speed, it doesn't tend to smooth as much as using it on low speed. So my sandpaper has left little scratches in the acrylic. By doing this, I'm taking out those little scratches. Now again, for a simple little acrylic partial like this, in the lab, I normally wouldn't bother with all of this. If I'm in the clinic and I don't have a proper polishing area, then yeah, this is what I'm going to have to do. So there's our coarse. I'm going to go to the finer. So this is a medium rubber. As I said, you don't have to do all of these steps. I'm just trying to demo all of these different possibilities to you. The most difficult place to polish, generally in any upper denture, is there in the vault of the palette. So this is now pretty smooth, and it should be fairly easy to polish. The finer burr or rubber here will actually give this a little bit of polish. Again, not something I would normally do for a little case like this. But in an emergency, or when you don't have access to all of your usual polishing equipment in clinic, or for whatever reason, and I could now take this and use triply on a buff in the handpiece, and then high shine it, and for an emergency case, that would do. Now I'm going to go and polish and pumice and polish this. A couple of other things that I want to go over very briefly. Little, not tips and tricks, but something else that that students sometimes have difficulty with is polishing their wax-ups. This is a fairly high-density foam. We generally, in the lab, we get it. This is the foam that tends to come in the boxes that the denture teeth are shipped in. And if you take it and just cut that up into little squares that are about, 1.25 inches, so they're maybe 3-4 centimeters square, and then put it on a split mandrel. If you use this in your hand piece and just gently go over your wax up, this will polish your wax up beautifully without having to do flaming, without having to use wax solvent. It just polishes the wax beautifully. This partial that you're doing right now, we don't have any clasps on this. But if we had clasps after we're done all of the trimming here, some people like to smooth and polish their clasps before they do the processing, before they put them on the model. Some like to do it after. You're going to use either a rubber wheel or a rubber point to smooth and polish your wires. I've got that, okay. With your rubber points, when you use a rubber point, put it on the mandrel. It can be hard to get on the mandrel. One easy way to do it is put it into the bench lathe and then hold the rubber point, and you can screw it onto the mandrel like that. Okay? But before you use the rubber point, you have to dress it, very much like you had to dress your large fast cut.